gonna do a reaction video today on the channel. Tom Grossi did a video called Hockey Deserves Better. Now, I haven't watched this yet, so I'll be doing kind of some commentary as I watch, maybe give my opinion, so I'm interested in what he has to say. If you don't know Tom Grossi, he makes some great NFL content, kind of known as a Packers fan, very entertaining, very funny. I'll have the video, and he's a bigger channel than me, so you probably know about him more than you know about my small little channel. But let's kind of get right into it. Ooh, he's wearing the Kraken journey. Let's uni.
On Monday night, the Florida Panthers won the Stanley Cup for the first time in their franchise's history. It was the culmination of a fantastic NHL postseason, which featured some insane goals, double overtimes, and 4 Game 7s, which also includes the Stanley Cup finals. The finals themselves had an insane buzz about them because there was almost a reverse sweep, which would have made the Florida Panthers basically the equivalent of the Atlanta Falcons.
Yeah, pretty much. Would have been the ultimate 28 for 3 comeback. I mean, as a Pats fan, I was on the good side of that collapse by the Falcons. But yeah, there was some good hype. Now, I would say, just small interjection, because of it being the Florida Panthers, for good, bad, or indifferent, some people don't view hockey, Florida as a traditional hockey market, so they kind of poo-poo it. I mean, the running jokes in hockey fan base for years have been Florida's like whole 7 fans, which really hasn't been the case. They had passionate fans, but just really terrible ownership, so that's a whole different conversation. But yeah, there was a lot of buzz. I mean, Panthers, could they win their first cup in the franchise's history? And could the Edmonton Oilers win the first cup for Canada in like over 30 years? So yeah, there was a lot of interesting storylines, especially when it was forced to Game 7. And you could have saw history if the Oilers did win.
Sorry, Falcons fans. Yes, you are still catching shade even in a hockey video.
Oh, what a loser!
So why am I making this video when by all accounts things were a success? Ratings jumped 43% during the finals. On top of that, over 4 million people tuned into Game 6 alone. And like I said, we crowned a first ever Stanley Cup winner. So what's the problem? The problem is that despite all the positives I just mentioned, in my opinion, I believe that the presentation of the game is inhibiting hockey rather than growing the sport. At this point, I also think it's really important that I disclaim that I am the definition of a casual fan. I played some roller hockey growing up, but I honestly didn't get into the sport until about 2 years ago. So I'm not an expert or even a longtime fan of the NHL.
So I'll say this. I actually think it's important to get a casual's perspective and somebody that's just getting into hockey in comparison to somebody like me that's been following it since like the age of like 2 and 3 years old. Right? I've been a passionate hockey fan for years and years and years. I actually want to know what the casuals thinks because sometimes, and I'll fully admit this, maybe I kind of just turn a blind eye to some negative things because it's like I'm just so used to it. I do think there are some problems with the presentation, but I don't want to keep interrupting. I'll let the man speak.
Years ago, I randomly turned on the playoffs and was immediately hooked by a sport that I hadn't really given much of a chance to. And since then, I have now chosen a team. Go Kraken.
Yeah. Well, do you... I guess I strongly disagree with that.
And I've made a concerted effort to learn about the sport that captivated me 2 years ago. I say this disclaimer for a couple of reasons. One, I am still learning about this sport. I'm still learning about the ins and outs. I'm still learning about the rules. I'm still learning about the players. I'm not completely familiar with the illustrious history that hockey has. And I'm not claiming to be an expert in any way, shape, or form. So this is not a I know better than you video. So the real reason I'm disclaiming why I'm a casual fan is because I would imagine that I am the exact type of fan the NHL, just like any sports league, is looking for when they're trying to grow their fan base.
Absolutely.
So from a casual fan's point of view, here has been my experience in trying to navigate and learn about the insane world of hockey.
Damn it!
That goal regulation size or what?
I love that movie, but I think it's I think it is important to again get the casuals perspective because that is how you do grow the fan base. Because there are some elitist fans that'll be like, well, you should know that. Like, no, Most hockey fans don't know the rich tradition of the NHL. I'm not gonna sit here and claim I know every single season, every single historical figure, but back like statistically by the back of my hand. I just don't. Right? It's just there's a lot of history in the NHL. But if you do want to grow as a sport, you have to kind of welcome the casuals and not kind of have that standoffish behavior. So I think his input's actually it's gonna be interesting.
So let's begin with the reason that I got into hockey in the first place. The product. The product on the ice is fantastic. It's fast, it's exciting, and for the most part, it's pretty nonstop. My main familiarity is obviously with the NFL, so throughout this video, I'll be making some comparisons to the NFL just to help illustrate my viewpoint here. Without getting into the presentation yet, hockey itself is so radically different from the NFL in the best way. The tension that builds throughout a game and a series is super organic. So for example, if you have a fight in game 2 between two high-profile players,
You want to go?
that's going to continue into game 3 and game 4 and game 5. And as the series goes on, the tension just builds more and more, which ultimately makes each game, period, or moment even better. It's hard hitting, it's physical, so you have that comparison to football. And while, of course, they've done some stuff in previous years to kind of limit it a little bit, it still seems to be a core foundation of the sport, which is something I really respect. It's also really fast, which for some people, it might be a little bit overwhelming. But for me, it just makes it that you can't take your eye off the action for even a second because you could miss that split-second goal or a game-changing penalty. Compared to the NFL, there is far less downtime, which makes it so much more exciting. With the NFL's TV broadcast, you have commercials sometimes every single 5 minutes.
Yeah.
A kickoff, a change of possession, a penalty, an instant replay.
Yeah, that is kind of the benefit of hockey, in my opinion, is that it's not as commercial bound. I mean, even the NBA, right? The NBA is like the final couple minutes of the game. It's like, Jesus, they extend that thing for an hour, it seems like. So I could understand that because the NFL, it's like a commercial break every 3 and out after you punt, commercial break. So if you have a very slow-paced game, you're seeing a lot of commercials.
There's constant commercials. And while there are commercials during NHL and hockey, it's nowhere near the level that the NFL has. In fact, the biggest complaint I heard about hockey before starting to watch it was that sometimes it's tough to follow the action because the puck is so small. And while I agree there are definitely some times I have stood there and yelled, "Where is the puck?" I think it, again, just makes it more exciting because I am forced to pay attention to this sport. It's not a passive viewing experience, it's an active one, which makes the sport and viewing it that much more exciting. In 2022, I bought tickets to my first ever NHL game. I live in New York, so I went to Madison Square Garden, which just turned out to be the most expensive place, apparently.
Yeah.
And it was
Well,
electric
Toronto,
inside.
probably more, but yeah.
Hot diggity dog. This place is magnificent.
The Rangers wound up losing that game, but I had such a great time, and seeing it in person was completely different from what I was seeing on the broadcast. For example, when you go to NFL games, you're waiting around for a while. It happens with wrestling all the time when I go to those events. The commercial breaks are long. But with hockey, because there are less commercials and the action is so fast-paced, you're not sitting around waiting for the next thing to happen a lot. It was that experience that drove me to look for tickets this year, and by complete and total luck, I was able to snag some amazing tickets on the day of the event, and this was my view. Now, that was a unique experience, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to afford those tickets ever again, but just like in 2022, I had a complete blast.
Yeah, I mean, those are really nice seats. Sometimes a little hard to follow the other side of the rink's action, but those are nice, right by the glass.
I can honestly say that seeing those two games in person were some of the best sporting experiences I've ever had in my life.
Sorry for pausing this. I apologize. I'm just trying to at least make it now where I'm just like letting the video play. But I actually think hockey is a sport that is best viewed in person. A little bit easier to track, in my opinion, but also for example, like I saw Connor McDavid live. On the TV, he's fast, don't get me wrong. But when you watch him in person, it's like a different level of fast. Like that it makes you appreciate the speed they're playing the game at far more, in my opinion.
Nice.
So it's safe to say that after watching a few years of hockey on TV and going to 2 games, I was hooked on the product, which was one of the reasons why I was so excited for this year's postseason, even though my Kraken weren't in it.
I'm done. Cut the show. I'm done.
And that brings us to the main point of this video, the presentation. In terms of accessibility, the games, they were on a lot of different networks. They were on ESPN, ABC, TBS, TNT, and ESPN2. Now, I'm not going to get into the accessibility issue during the regular season because that's a whole other beast. And as someone who now has to buy a cajillion different streaming services to see the NFL, I understand. And unfortunately, that just seems the way that a lot of sports leagues are going, just trying to make more money and making fans shell out if they want to watch their teams.
I'll say this. It is aggravating as a hockey fan. I wish they used to, just have NHL.tv. I wish they just had a subscription service just for the NHL. And I understand that would probably cut into the regional networks, and that's why they don't do it. But it is frustrating to have, ESPN. You have to have TNT. And the one thing is, if you do have ESPN Plus, you can still watch it, the ABC, because it's all owned by Disney, ESPN, ABC. It's under that umbrella. But still, it is very kind of frustrating at times where it's like, oh, it's on TNT tonight. Oh, it's on ESPN, which might not seem like that big of a deal, but if you are just a streamer and you do not have cable, it makes it a far more complicated. Then you have to pay for an additional service that, in my opinion, you shouldn't have to. This is why I wish these leagues would have, well, it should be more, speaking of the NHL, just had an NHL.tv, you pay a certain fee. Maybe it's a little bit more expensive than the regional to kind of, make up for that loss. But it is a frustrating thing as a hockey fan dealing with the jumping around of, for me, for example, it being on Nesson, maybe then being on TNT, then being on ESPN Plus, then being on something obscure. It does get frustrating trying to follow your team and tonight I can't watch this because, oh shoot, I forgot, I don't have TNT. That happened before I ended up getting it later in the season. It's frustrating.
Which is incredibly disappointing, but that's not even the main point of this video. In terms of presentation, the commentators range from really, really good to not so great.
Yep.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Everyone, of course, has different preferences on how they're going to watch their favorite sports. I mean, heck, we had 50,000 people in here watching me watch the 49ers Packers. I get it. But for the most part, when it came to the national broadcasting team, it just seemed like there was a level of information that was missing. It didn't really help grow my knowledge or love for the sport, and it seemed to be very, very surface level. It wasn't until I listened to local or regional broadcasts that I learned more about the players, the storylines, and the teams themselves. However, my biggest gripe wasn't with the commentators. I can mute them, or I can watch somebody else, or listen to another broadcast. My biggest gripe was how the game was marketed and presented once it was time for puck drop. The desk. On ESPN, the desk that commentators were forced to broadcast from was a joke. And while I understand it's a little bit ridiculous to complain about, it makes it seem like the sport/game is not taken seriously, which is a vast difference from those broadcasting networks covering things like the NFL or the NBA. And I keep harping on this presentation aspect because that, in my opinion, is a huge factor if you're trying to grow a league/sport. For example, imagine if during the NFL playoffs, the commentators were given what was essentially an IKEA desk. Or maybe there's just name tags that are flashing on the screen, but only for some players. Or maybe it's just the nuisance of the constant ads that are changing around the rink that are done digitally, by the way. Or what if during the final minute of regulation, while the game was tied, they switched over to warm-ups of a completely different game?
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
All of that happened during this year's coverage of the NHL playoffs, and none of that helps grow the game. Now, again, there are errors that are going to be made, absolutely, and I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus for that. However, it just seemed like the constant disrespect to the audience's time and investment and engagement that is going to wind up hurting the game and people coming back to watch it.
Agreed, 100% agreed on this. But the reason why I agree with this one so heavily, now, the desk, funny enough, I didn't really notice that because I hate to say it this way, because I do make content. I don't watch the intermissions as much. I'm usually editing, chopping up games. That's why I was able to kind of have very in-depth videos quickly after the game. So I was able to have it up in a couple hours, even though they were sometimes 8 minutes to 10, 12 minutes long, right? Because I was editing in between intermissions and getting clips ready. But in that sense, I do agree. There was too many errors in that regard. Like the biggest flaw, right, is when the Florida Panthers Barkov raised the Stanley Cup. They didn't get it immediately on ESPN. They messed up. They completely missed it. I know some of that was some of the camera work, but I'm like, that's something you should always just be on top of. That's something you always got to get. It just presentation style, I would say, yeah, it definitely needs to be improved. And just, I understand the NHL doesn't bring in NBA money, NFL money, but it still brings in some money. It should be far more cleaned up than it is, production-wise.
Oh, and by the way, when that broadcast switched over, it was during a power play, too.
Wix gives you the power of AI to build the website you need.
If I'm watching hockey for the first time, those things are not going to make it easier for me to enjoy the game, and it's not going to incentivize me to return back to the game. When you're trying to grow a fan base or an audience, you don't want to give the viewer a reason not to tune back in, especially because of the way the sport is being presented. Because you're going to have good games and bad games in any sport. Hell, look at a lot of the primetime games that I stream on here. That can't be controlled unless you have a really good scriptwriter. But the thing that can be controlled is how the sport is presented. And when there's a lack of care or effort in that presentation, and you're giving the viewer a reason not to be engaged and not to be invested, then it's a disservice to the sport itself. Yeah. And I'm not making this video to crap on a particular broadcast or a particular person. Instead, I'm making this video because hockey is really freaking awesome.
Hockey is awesome, okay? You need to know this.
And if there are viewers who are being dissuaded from watching because the broadcast is missing vital resources like informed commentators or a desk that's usable, there is something wrong. And let me be clear, this is for the playoffs. We're not even talking about the regular season. And I understand why there isn't as much care or effort for certain sports. For example, during the 22-23 NHL season, the revenue that the NHL brought in was over $6 billion. For the NBA during that season, it was over $10 billion. And for the NFL, it was over $16 billion. The NFL is on track by 2027 to reach over $25 billion a year.
Crazy.
There is a pretty sizable margin between all of these sports leagues.
Oh, that's savage.
You serious?
So I understand the appropriation of resources, and I understand why the NBA and the NFL are going to get preferential treatment. It's about money, and it's about viewership. However, the NHL is growing in popularity. They just finished their longest and most successful season yet, and hell, they even had guys like me, a casual fan, trying to watch the Rangers game when I was in London doing the International Stadium Tour. And with more revenue and resources, look at the NFL. They have one of the best TV broadcasts and presentations in the world. And with all those resources and extra money, the NFL is one of the leading organizations on how they present their game to the world on TV. Tom Brady is literally going to be a commentator this year. The video packages, the storylines, all of it is presented to the casual fan, and it makes it a spectacle. And hockey, they have legends commentating on the game. And the way they break down the game is how I've learned the majority of my hockey knowledge. They have all this stuff, it's just on a reduced budget. And as the game continues to grow, I hope they use that extra revenue to enhance the viewing experience, whether it is the commentators or whether it's just how the product looks. And I want to be very clear that just because less people are watching and it's making less money, that doesn't excuse the lack of care or effort or attention that the sport is being presented with.
I would argue, I definitely agree with that. It's like you're still making billions and billions of revenue. It should at least afford a better desk, probably bring in some better commentators. There were some really good ones, but then there was also some ones not so great. You know, I think it's kind of a feeling out process. The good thing for the NHL is it is growing. It is going in the right direction. Interesting article he kind of showed about hockey kind of shrinking in Canada, growing in the U.S. That's interesting. I think there's a lot of reasonings for that, mainly due to Canada maybe probably struggling to get a cup back home. But, you know, the game is growing, and that's important. It's growing in non-traditional hockey markets. And I think they should be able to, well, yes, they're not getting NFL, NBA money. They're still making a lot. And they should make the presentation far better than it is.
You don't need an insane budget to get a better desk. You don't need an insane budget to find a way to censor curse words at the end of the Stanley Cup separation without these weird long pauses in the middle of the broadcast. Because when you make the presentation of the sport look cheap, when you don't put a ton of care or attention or effort into it, fans are going to tune out, especially casual fans who are tuning in for the first time. I know it's pretty subjective, but my feed was filled with brand new hockey fans who were tuning in for the first time during Game 7. That's what you want. And yes, the presentation of Game 7 was better. However, it shouldn't take until the Super Bowl of your sport, which, by the way, could have ended a few games earlier, for you to go, you know what, let's get a nice desk. Let's make sure the presentation is up to par. So let me end by just saying this. Hockey is an awesome sport. It's fast, it's growing, and you do not need to be an expert to really enjoy it, because look at me. And from an outsider's perspective, it feels like there's still so much growth that can occur with the game. I know the NHL just started leaning into this a little bit more, but it's focusing on your star players because that is how fans are going to relate to the game and also their team. It's allowing them to show off their personality. And I know you're not allowed to drop F-bombs on national broadcast, but there's a better way to do it and make it work so that fans can still share that excitement with their team. This sport features insane athletes just like any other sport, and it's learning about the individuals, which is going to help people develop a longer lasting love and investment in the game itself. For me, I learned a lot of the players from playing NHL 23. I know it's not the best way, but heck, I learned a lot of players through fantasy football or Madden. And it doesn't matter how you get into the game. What matters is that once you are willing to invest your time, money, and energy into watching or attending the game, it should be rewarded with at least the bare minimum presentation.
Yeah.
And for the playoffs, I think they fell short of that. And saying all of this has not diluted my love for the game at all. I still want to learn more. I'm excited to watch more hockey. There are so many things about this sport that make it great. And so if you're on the fence, I highly recommend giving it a shot. And for the powers that be, just buy your commentators a better desk.
I mean, yeah, that's a pretty easily fixable solution to that. Yeah, I mean, getting a better desk, yeah, that would make a lot more sense. Tom Grossi, great video, man. Yeah, I actually appreciate him making content about hockey. He has a huge NFL channel, over 600,000 subscribers. Yeah, he gets millions and millions of views per month. So yeah, that was actually kind of cool to see him make a video about a sport that he generally doesn't cover. And kind of cool to hear his story of becoming a hockey fan. And even though he's in New York, becoming a Seattle Kraken fan, which makes sense, right? You're able to grow with that franchise. But I think he made a lot of solid points. I do think the presentation for the NHL needs to be a little bit more on point. Some things he noticed that I just didn't. I'll say the desk thing I just did not notice, which is kind of surprising because like in Nesson, my local broadcast, they have a really nice desk, so I don't know why they cheaped out in the playoffs. I don't know, that's a peculiar decision. But yeah, I think there's a lot of points, solid points he made here. For me, what I just like overall is, and they won't do this, but is the NHL made just an NHL.TV subscription. Even if I had to pay a little bit more, just so I can get all the games under one service, kind of like I do with AHL.TV, where I have a subscription service that I can see every AHL team's games and just broadcast. I think it would be worth it, in my opinion, and lessen these walls. They won't happen because they do have that deal with Disney. They have that split deal with TNT. I understand that there's a lot of things at play which make that impossible to happen, but just as a fan of hockey myself, I think that would kind of lessen some of the aggravation of having these multiple subscriptions to multiple different services to just watch a damn hockey game of the same team. But I'd like to know your thoughts down below in the comment section. What did you think of what Grossi had to say? Did you agree, disagree? I've got the Paul. See you in the next one.